So for today's gospel, first we need to have a little context. And then I want to use a description of love. And then lastly, the tree of life. So first, context. In the gospel today, Jesus goes to an area north of the Sea of Galilee called Caesarea Philippi. And it's a very famous site. It's where the tribe Dan was located. And it has a long history. At one time when it was pagan territory, there were temples to the god Baal there. And during the Greek times, there was a temple to the god Pan. And then when King Jeroboam split the kingdom of Israel into the northern and southern kingdoms, Jeroboam thought, well, if the people keep going to Jerusalem to worship, they might start following the king of the southern kingdom again. So he had this brilliant idea. He created a temple for worship in this location, and he made a golden calf so the people could come there to worship. Because, of course, that worked so well in the past, right? Sometimes we don't learn from the past. And so Jeroboam was known as the king that led the northern kingdom into idolatry. Not a great reputation. And so this is the site of where Jesus asks his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" Now, of course, Peter gets the right answer, but he has the wrong understanding. Peter's understanding of what the Messiah is another king like David, someone who will be a political ruler, someone who will kick out the Romans, someone who will reestablish power and control for the kingdom of Israel. That's what Peter had in mind. Unfortunately, that is not what Jesus had in mind. Jesus had a far different understanding. And it's similar for us. Sometimes I think we approach our relationship with God kind of like the prosperity gospel. We assume that if we're faithful to God, if we follow God's commandments, if we practice our faith regularly, then everything will go our way. Everything will be fine. That's the prosperity gospel. And it's a false gospel. It's a false understanding of our lives in Christ. And the reason why it's false is because of what Jesus says. Unless you take up your cross and follow me, you cannot be my disciple. Well, a cross is not a prosperity gospel. A cross is really all about love. Now, the University of Notre Dame has a great theology department. They really have got some brilliant professors. And every year their theology department has a t-shirt, because it's college, you got to have a t-shirt. And their t-shirt for this year has a phrase on it, and it's, I think, very, very profound. It says, "All love is a rehearsal for death." I know it's kind of morbid, but all love is a rehearsal for death. If you think about it, love, if it's really love, always goes out of itself. Love, if it's really true love, if it's unconditional love, is sacrificial. Love, if it's really love, ultimately offers the complete gift of self. And that's why they say it's a rehearsal for death, because, of course, when we die, we offer ourselves completely to God. And that's why love has to embrace the cross. But love always has a happy ending. And that's why the image on the wall behind me is called the tree of life. If you look at the crucifix and you see coming out from the base of the crucifix these vines. And the image really is a replica, sort of a church in Rome called St. Clement's. And the tree of life emanates from the cross. And it emanates from it because the cross was an instrument of torture and death, the scariest thing that people could have seen at that time. But because the love that Jesus had for us, because of the love that Jesus has for each of us individually, that cross becomes a tree of life. And those vines coming out are really a symbol of the church, because the church exists as a result of that sacrifice of Christ on the cross. And as it branches out, it gives life to all who embrace the cross. And those streams coming out from the bottom are the 4 rivers of Eden, because it reminds us that God's plan for us was not suffering and death. God's plan for us was the Garden of Eden. But when sin entered into the world, God's response to our sin was in love to offer himself to us completely. And of course, that gives us the model and the ability to offer ourselves back to God completely. And so in love, we follow Jesus Christ, the crucified. And it's important for us to have that identity of the cross present in our minds, because if we don't, then we start to take on a false understanding of how our life in Christ looks. Our life in Christ is going to have moments where we're invited to embrace the cross. Our life in Christ is going to ask us to share in that suffering of Christ. Not because God is a cruel God, but because God knows that every life has a share of suffering, and he himself wants to be present to us in that suffering. God never leaves us alone. And so this weekend, the scriptures invite us to hear that message of what it really means to follow Jesus Christ, what it means to be invited to take up our cross and be a follower of the crucified one, what it means to be people who are loved by God so completely that God offers himself to us entirely in order that we might offer ourselves back to the Lord.